Okay, so this is Katalin Ratz, and today it is February 23rd, 2019, and we are sitting in the Judaica Suite at the University of Florida with
Teresa Porzekanski Cohen.
So I would like to ask first about your parents.
Sure.
If you could say your father's name, and if he was born in Uruguay, and if not, where he came from.
Okay, my father's name is Abram Porzekanski. He was born in Libau, Latvia, in 1912. And he came to Uruguay when he was 14 years old in a ship, the Württemberg, in 1928. And then in Uruguay, he adopted a new Spanish name, Jorge. So he was Abram Jorge Porzekanski.
And was this a religious family?
No, not at all. They were all secular. They had been under the German rule in Latvia. They were alternating between the Russian rule and the German rule. So they were very secular, and they spoke many languages, German also included.
And when they arrived to Uruguay, they didn't change this secular way of life?
No, no. They went being secular.
And could you say a few words about your mother and her family?
My mother was born in Uruguay in 1912 also. She was the daughter of a Syrian immigrant who had come to Buenos Aires in 1907. And Lebanese mother, she had also you fix that, to Buenos Aires in 1910. Then they met in Buenos Aires, her parents, and they came to live in Montevideo.
And do you know why they moved from Buenos Aires?
Yeah, because Buenos Aires had certain rules for weddings. And I think they didn't have the papers correct. And in Montevideo, the law for marriages was more fluent and free. So they came to Montevideo to get married, but then they stayed.
And when you speak about marriage, you refer to the state laws, not
the state law, because now I can add that in Buenos Aires they also had a religious rule, like they had to marry through the church or through some church. And when my grandparents, when they came to Uruguay, they got this secular rule. They were married under the state law.
So they don't have a ketubah?
No, they didn't. They were very poor. They were living in a boarding house in a room. So, she was a seamstress. She was sewing clothes. And my grandfather, he got these clothes and went to sell them door by door.
So I'm just completely going off script. So when I read in the Perfumes of Carthage about this seamstress whose husband sells clothes, is it a autobiographical? Like, is it
well, everything I write is fiction, basically, but it has some sort of connection, minimum connection with real experiences. But of course, everything that I write is not thought to represent it's not biographical.
No, but were you thinking about your...
Yeah, of course. Every writer writes from their heart, and what's inside his heart or her heart? Experience. So you have this experience. What do you do with this experience?
Okay. So when you grew up in Montevideo, who was in the house? Like, were your grandparents close to you?
Yeah, they came very often. Both grandparents. but mostly the Sephardim ones. They had a lot of influence on my mother, on me and my brother. We were four, my parents and my brother and me, but also, you know, many times my grandmother would take care of us. My grandfather would take us out. So the link was more with the Sephardim.
And the link in terms of human connections, and also in terms of food and how the apartment looked like?
Food and the ornaments and the taste, the style of living was more influenced for me from the Sephardim.
And did you ever feel kind of interested to explore more about the Ashkenazi part?
Then when I was a teenager, then the secular intellectual myth or something, then I discovered that, and then I wanted to be like my father wanted me to be, like this kind of good student, very intellectual, very secular, because those were opposite worlds, like the Sephardim with the Ashkenazim. They were opposite, and I lived through that.
And can you kind of say more about what it means opposite? Like, how does it manifest itself?
Like the world of this Sephardi family was more based on affections and on feelings and emotions, basically, and strong emotions. But the world of the Ashkenazim was more rational. They were more like, they took more distance from emotions. They would take decisions based on rationalistic motives, like you have to be this because of this and that. It's better for you to be this or to do this. So these two worlds were in opposition, and then you can see this in not only in Perfumes of Carthage. You can see this in The Skin of the Soul, or like my latest work was Live, to live and to wonder. To live and to wonder. Okay, because these two worlds were in opposition, sometimes in tension, right? And me, and as a teenager, and my brother too, you know, we have these conflicting thoughts about who do I want to be, in which way I'm going to define myself, okay? That's interesting because for teenagers, teenagers without conflicts are no good. They have to have these conflicts in order to grow up.
And so did you translate this tension also the professional influences? I didn't ask you what was your father and mother professional, but
my father was with a lot of sacrifices. He studied and went into university and became a dentist, and was very successful. He had a lot of patients. Many of them were immigrants because he spoke this German and he spoke Polish, and so everyone who came to Uruguay as an immigrant and didn't know where to go in order to, you know, to have the health care of the teeth would finally arrive at my father because he could speak the language. So he was very successful, and my mother was a housewife. In this Sephardic world, especially the Arabic world, they came from these Arabic ghettos inside Syria and Lebanon. The women were not supposed to work except inside the house. And they weren't supposed to study or to go to high school. Sometimes they even weren't supposed to go to elementary school. So my mother went to elementary school in public school in Uruguay, but she didn't finish elementary school because they were very poor, and because her father wouldn't allow her to finish elementary school, because it wasn't supposed, you know, you weren't supposed to know anything about anything. Just stay home, be happy.
And by the time you became a teenager, or to go to secondary school and to university?
I had this great conflict with my uncle, the brother of my mother. Mm-hmm. Why would you want to go to high school? What for? And okay, go to high school, and after, why would you want to go further? Why? No. And so there was this, but my father, of course, he really backed me, and he wanted me to go on studying. So there was this conflict inside in the family between my father and my uncle. It was interesting because this uncle of mine, whose name was Victor, he didn't allow his girl to go further than high school. And she, who is my cousin, she hated that. And she couldn't do anything about it. Then she would look at me and say, you are lucky, you know, you're allowed to go and to be whatever you want to be. It's interesting inside the same family to have this kind of conflicts.
And later, did you remain in contact with your cousin?
Yes. She got a boyfriend, she got married. She was a very good girl and housewife. But late in life, she started to study drawing and painting. But I always had this impression that she was really frustrated at a very young age. Mm.
And did it influence you in your professional life or your later life that you had part of the family who remained within the confines of those values?
Yes, because I felt they looked at me, they looked up at me in a different way, like, you know, who is she? Why would she do this? Mm-hmm. But of course, everything I'm speaking about is very subtle. It's not like, you know, you had an open conversation about this. No one said, well, I don't think this is your place. Just nobody spoke openly, but these conflicts were underneath.
And could you say something about the language situation? Like, if you have an uncle who comes from an Arabic speaking background and a father who comes from the multilingual but European, how do they communicate, and how does the language affect that kind of communication?
Yeah. So when my mother wanted to say something that we children wouldn't listen to or wouldn't want us to listen, she would speak in Arabic with my grandmother and grandfather. Okay, so there was this world of a secret thing going on, you know? And of course my uncle also he spoke in Arabic. Mm-hmm. So my father was more adjusted to what Uruguay was becoming in those times. He would learn, he would speak Spanish very fluently. He would be open to new things and changes. There was this kind of opposition between my father and my uncle in other issues, like, you know, like becoming a professional, a secular Jew, politically aware was one thing. And then in this other part of the family was like, they would live inside their homes. They would be interested in money and materialist way of living, but they wouldn't care very much about culture, about developing oneself and their children.
And so I think we established that this coming from two very different cultural backgrounds, or having these two very different cultural backgrounds in your everyday life, was a very important kind of element of your childhood and
yes, it was. It was.
And would you say something like, where else do you see its significance?
Yeah, well, my childhood wasn't an easy one. I wasn't a peaceful subject. I was maturing more quickly than a child should. I think looking at it from now, well, like I'm 73, so now I can say that. Now when I look at children, how they grow, I see that there's a peaceful way of growing, okay? But because these conflicts I'm talking to you about were also inside this need for adjustment to this new society. So it wasn't only this conflict, but showing a face outside, how you grow in this community that wasn't a Jewish community. It was the Uruguayan society, where I went to public school, to public high school, to public university. So I had to create this personality, a new one, to go on further with my growing up, which wasn't easy. I think my brother also had the same conflicts. This means it wasn't because of me, but it was because of this household. That was where we grew up. Mm.
And could you say a few words about him? Like what profession did he?
He wanted, like for example, it's a good question. He wanted to be a theater actor, a drama actor. How do you say in English? Mm-hmm. And because he had a lot of conditions for that. Had a great voice. He was very good looking. He loved literature and history. But he found the teacher and the school where to go after high school. But my mother wouldn't let that. But how come my son is going to be a theater actor? It's unusual. This world of actors is terrible. It's corrupted. You could become this or that. Something would happen to you. Okay, so he also had these conflicts, and my mother, as a mother of a boy, she was very much more. She was harder on him than on me, because I could escape because my father was backing me, but he couldn't. My brother couldn't escape this problem. So he quit. So he became a businessman. Which is not bad, but it's not what he wanted.
And you wanted anthropology? Like you wanted when you chose your path?
Yeah.
Was it something that you wanted?
Yeah, I really did. I was a rebel, finally, because I didn't have any other way in the middle. So I had to do what I had to do.
And do you think that anthropology is a rebellious
It is, because anthropology, among other many issues, studies the conflicts, the cultural conflicts.
Okay, it's a very interesting way of defining what anthropology is.
Yes.
This is why I'm asking how you see it as a professional choice. So would you say a few words about how your professional life was affected by your, aside from the choice, later on when you went on publishing, finding research questions, did your personal background
had any influence? Yes,
and
of
how?
Course. Well, all the research I did about Uruguayan Jewish immigration was based on trying to understand all these different kind of Jewish communities that came in Uruguay and how they managed to adjust to Uruguayan society, but also to adjust among themselves. Because I'm going to develop this point at the Congress on Tuesday, how the inside structure of the Jewish community in Uruguay has special qualities. And some of these qualities have to do with these separate identities of these minorities. It wasn't an only minority that, seeing from outside, you could think of as homogeneous. Mm-hmm. No. I had very, very specific differences, and how these Jews had to build a community, but also to be aware of these differences and conflicts between these communities inside the big community. So that was my research, and then I took this research to the end, and to understanding why the Islamic world affected the Sephardim in such a way that they were almost more Islamic. I'm sorry about this. We'll edit this. How the Sephardim that came to Uruguay were so much influenced by their Islamic environments at the beginning that they couldn't really manage an adjustment as the Ashkenazim did.
Could you say a few words why you choose to use the word Islamic and not Arabic? Like, or how do you differentiate?
Because these Arab countries, Lebanon and Syria, where the main religion was Islamic. So it wasn't because they were Arabic. It was because this way of thinking was Islamic. And what is this Islamic way of thinking? It's very drastic. It's very drastic. It's very black or white. Mm-hmm. It's very, I don't know in English the word, like there aren't middle tones. Mm-hmm. Do you understand?
Yeah, of course. Like it's very, there are only extremes. There is nothing in between.
And the hatred and love are also extremes. Mm-hmm. Like in my family, on the Sephardic side, there were relatives that because of a small offense, like I forgot to say hello or something like that, mm-hmm. wouldn't speak to each other for 20 years. So isn't that extreme? So why do you have this kind of behavior? It's because they were living for centuries. These Arab Jews were always in these countries. They didn't come to Lebanon, or they didn't arrive to Syria. They had been there from thousands of years. It's their land. It was their land where they lived, their ancestors. Mm-hmm. However, these other Sephardic Jews, the Spanish Jews, they came from the Mediterranean to Spain or to Portugal or to Holland, right? So they came, they arrived. But these Jews, my ancestors, they were living for thousands. Even when the land was conquered by Egyptians, Phoenicians, and other cultures, these Jews had remained under the rule of these different empires, including Rome, had remained there until until they were converted mm-hmm. into Islam. So it's very interesting to know that the systems of religion are not just beliefs; they are ways of life, mm-hmm. the ways of living. So if you're a minority inside the big Islamic society, you behave exactly as the rest.
And did you see any influence after, like, Uruguay's influence or the Uruguayan society's influence on your Sephardic part of your family?
Yeah. There were some. The Uruguayan society the Uruguayan society had been also confirmed by immigration. Big quantities of Italians and mm-hmm. Spaniards. First Spaniards, but Italians were as important as Spaniards in the conformation of the Uruguayan society. Very, very important. Italians brought a structure of the family that was very interesting for the Arabic immigrants, because men were very important, and the men were the leading role in the family. Women are secondary or third roles. And there are a lot of similarities between this, the structure of the Italian family and the structure of the Islamic family. Mm-hmm. So the Arabic, the Jewish immigrants that arrived in Uruguay had these models, and so they kept these ways of behavior.
So it's reinforced, basically.
Reinforced,
that,
reinforced.
And as your work on Jewish immigrants in Uruguay, I'm not familiar with all your work, so I would like to speak about it or ask you about it. So your work on Jewish immigrants in Uruguay, does it kind of overlap with the study of other immigrant groups? And if you could please say a word. Yeah,
well, the first big research was Jewish immigration in Uruguay, but then when I discovered I could do that, I mean, why do I research? I research in order to clarify myself, first of all. I don't want to clarify anyone else, illuminate myself about one problem. Mm-hmm. Then I went on with the Afro-descendants, because they also were brought by force and by the business of Spain, Portugal, and Holland and UK, okay, to South America, and part of this slave trade went into Uruguay. So when I started this research on Afro-descendants, I found very many conclusions, very many understandings of why these minorities wouldn't adjust so easily, and they shared a lot with the Jews, starting from discrimination and poverty, okay? But they also they also had a lot of differences with the Jews. Okay, sometimes speaking English, I don't find this variety of vocabulary as I do in Spanish. I'm sorry.
But I think you can say it in Spanish, and it's totally fine, and we will have a translation.
Okay, but okay, no, I'm doing the effort in English. So I went into the Afro-descendant world, and I started with the oral history that I had done before with the Jews, and then what was interesting is that the Afro-descendants in Uruguay hadn't been taken attention by any researcher seriously. So when they discovered, I started with the African religions that they had brought to Uruguay, that they had mixed with the Catholic background that the Spaniards and Italians had brought before. That was great, because the syncretism of these systems of beliefs was very interesting for the new generations that didn't care very much about why the Afro-descendants were in Uruguay, what were their beliefs. They didn't care. So when I started to pay attention to them, the public press also started to pay attention to them. And them, the Afro-descendants, were organized in small groups, religious small groups, and they also began to pay attention to themselves and to ask the questions that any minority asks: where do I come from, who I am, etc. So when a researcher does that, it comes to the public agenda, the issue, and when you have that, it's very important, because the rest of the society also starts to pay attention. They were able to have a monument, to make a monument of one of the female god, of one of their goddesses, like Iemanjá, and in front of a park, in front of the beach. And they started to take these small steps in order to be recognized and to not to be discriminated. And they started to, you know, there was a whole revolution among them. They started to complain about the way they had been treated. Even if the university is a public, free university, the proportion of Afro-descendants inside the university was tiny. And other things. So that's the second big research I did. Then after that, I started to pay attention to ethnicity and identity as issues that you build. I mean, society builds. It's not a given thing that you come to a country and then, well, who I am. It's not a given. You have to construct it to build this. So and I went on from that on. And then I went back to the Jews to study the ideological trends of the Jewish immigrants, because these different forms of immigration were represented in the institutions that they founded. And so I found that within the Ashkenazim, there was a lot of differences inside. There were the communist Ashkenazim, the socialist Ashkenazim. There was the Yiddishist socialist Ashkenazim that were called the Bundists. There were the people that would wanted the children to learn Yiddish only. And the others who said, no, Yiddish is not important at all. We have to adjust to the new society. They could learn any other language. Not Yiddish, we have to forget. So when I started to understand that inside the Ashkenazim there were big oppositions, and that's the way the Jewish people think. Now there's this old joke, then when you have you have two Jewish people chatting, and then you have three opinions. Okay, this is true. And okay, so and how do you say, the consequences is for the non-Jewish societies, they started to see the Jews not as a stereotype, but what I wanted is to deconstruct, you can help me, the stereotype. Like the Jews, there are very many Jews, and kind of Jews as you can imagine. There's not one kind of Jews, because a stereotype is the basis for anti-Semitism. That's it. What is any prejudice? The basis is the stereotype. And so
I give you like a half a second of rest. So I have two questions based on what you just said. One is, did it come as a revelation also looking back to your Ashkenazi part of your family? Like, did it change your perception of that Ashkenazi part? One. And the second is that if you could say something how you perceive your role in changing. Maybe it's too big of a word.
Maybe it's not the right question, because I didn't do all this work in order to. I didn't really do all this work in order to put on the agenda a point. But afterwards, it turned out to be like that. So, but when I was doing this work, I didn't think about the consequences. But it did have real consequences in the society, in the Uruguayan society, in the conservative political positions of the Uruguayan politicians, because the politicians started to realize if they didn't recognize these Jewish differences, complexities, they won't have the votes of the Jewish community, even though the votes were not so important, because the quantity of the Jewish votes was very, very small. But incredibly, what anti-Semites think usually is that the Jews have a lot of power. That's one of the stereotypes in anti-Semitism. The Jews they have a lot of power, mysterious powers. But when I revealed that, as you said, no, they started saying, no, they are human too, you know, they have differences, and we have to understand this. So it was a small step in order to de-stereotype this image of the Jews, because in Uruguay, as in many other countries in Latin America, there's a lot of anti-Semitism, but it's very subtle. But in one of my students did the research comparing suspicion or hate against the Jews to suspicion or hate against the Afro-descendants, and compared to suspicion and hate to other foreigners of different countries like Koreans, Peruvians, okay, etc. And the proportion is that 33% of the people had prejudice against the Jews, while, for example, 20% of the people had prejudice against the Afro-descendant, and going down, okay. So you see that the Jewish image is special inside racism. It's a special image. And what researchers do in anthropology, well, I don't know if they do it exactly as I say, but is to try to deconstruct these images, the stereotyped images. And how do you do that? Showing the density of the problem, showing the variety, showing the conflicts inside.
So could you say something about your own family? Like, how did it affect your research, your view of the Ashkenazi part?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because like people from the Communist Party in Uruguay started to pay attention when they found that many of the unions, of the worker unions, had been founded by Jews. Mm-hmm. And because, you know, if they want, if a political party wants to have strength, they operate also with myths, and they try to have followers studying about some ideas. When they do that, the idea that, for example, the Union for Sewing Clothes was founded by left-wing Jews. Then they started to accept that the Jewish people was very useful for the working movement in Uruguay.
And was your father associated with any political?
No, he was mainly an independent. He wasn't very politically moved by anything. He would vote like El Partido Colorado, which was in those times a very progressive political party. Then later on, the left-wing parties would steal some ideas, basic ideas from the Colorado Party, mm-hmm. and take it to the left mm-hmm. parties. So no, my father wasn't politically very
inclined.
How do you say, aligned?
Inclined.
Inclined.
Didn't have it. So when you, my other question was more about how you perceive your work as Uruguay changes. Obviously, there were huge changes within the political system of Uruguay between the time that you finished your university studies and you started your professional life, yes. And most of your professional life was under the dictatorship.
Yes, under the dictatorship, mm-hmm. I started to teach as how do you say, the lower degree for a teacher. Mm-hmm. But when I started really to be successful was when the dictatorship ended. Mm-hmm. Because everything I was doing started to be published, and there was a big change in the whole Uruguayan society. So in a way, like I was needed to do certain things, to teach certain things. For example, prejudice.
So you started as a lecturer at the university.
Yes.
And you were, I assume, teaching courses that was needed in the university curriculum.
Yeah, even under dictatorship, I was able, and the university was intervened, and they would surveil the, how do you say, the agendas of your courses. I was teaching the same things because I changed the names. But because you can teach anything if you know how to teach. It's wider than a name.
So you changed the title of the course?
Not the title, but for example, the subject about prejudice and racism, I would say conflicts between cultures. Okay, so I would teach prejudice and racism, but then after the dictatorship, I was free, and then I really started to to teach things that I thought the Uruguayan kids should profit of knowing, and then it was very interesting because they would go into their families and would say, well, why are you prejudiced? Prejudice is this, that. Okay, so they would claim into their own families the ways in which people look at very many things. Like being fat, being skinny, being left-wing, being anything. Because it's the same structure. So I did that. I was very happy with the results. Finally, I was.
So you feel that you are teaching first as a first kind of wave, influence your students.
Yeah.
The university supported you institutionally, and then obviously you saw big changes in Uruguay as a whole, and you see your kind of place in that.
Yes,
changes.
Because that's a good question, because finally other historians and other anthropologists that are non-Jewish brought the issue of the Uruguayan identity, and there were many books about where do we come from. They were all immigrants. Finally, the natives had been exterminated, so we were all immigrants, and not only the Jews were immigrants. And when they became aware of that, the whole establishment in like the public history of the country changed, and new books were written from this new point of view. Like, this is a new society, we are all immigrants, and the Armenians, for example, started to do their own research about Armenian identity. The Japanese, other minorities started, and even the government was, now I remember, the government then founded a national day of immigration, okay? So in this day, all the meals, the different kind of food, and the dances of different minorities and cultures are celebrated. The Italians with different, like the Italians of the north, the Italians of the south, the dialects, the Italian dialects, also Spanish, the Spanish dialects. So it was very interesting how the Uruguayan society went in this big change, and not only because of me, because the dictatorship had ended, and there was this illusion, I'm skeptic, this illusion that the world was becoming better, and then you could have more freedom, and you could state who you are, and homosexuality flourished to be, an open way of showing homosexuality and gender issues and things like this.
And could you say a few words about how the Jewish community, that at the beginning of our discussion, conversation, you described as a very fragmented community. What happens after the dictatorship comes down? You already did your research. They could already read about it. What's the change, or was there a change? How did they reflect on your work? And
paradoxically, the Jewish community changed, but not that much. they kept being very conservative, because I think the Jewish community as a minority, like 12, now they are like 12 or 15,000 people. 12 or 15, that's not much inside 3.5 million, right? It's less than 0.1% or something like that. They are always afraid because, you know, they have seen such a long history of good times, but also followed by bad times, that they wouldn't allow themselves to really change much, because that's a problem. If I change too much, then I may lose who I was. Mm-hmm. And so this identity is based on who I was, always. I don't know if I answered your...
I mean, this reminds me what you said about the Sephardic part of your family, who were very connected to what their cultural kind of heritage. The other thing I was going to ask you about is your literary work.
Yeah.
We alluded to it at the beginning of the conversation. If you could say a few things or a few sentences, for instance, how your research affected, if at all. I mean, I understand that being one person, obviously there is a connection, but how you see your anthropological work and your literary work correspond? Or?
There's a connection. I would want this connection not to be obvious, but there is. For example, in this novel, The Skin of the Soul, okay, there are two stories that are intertwined. Mm-hmm. One of them is in Montevideo in the 50s, okay, it's a story. But the other one is in Spain in the 1400s, about Sephardic young woman who is being persecuted by the Inquisition. Mm-hmm. And for writing that, I had to study and research a lot of archives about the declarations of the accused by the Inquisition. Like they were, before being tortured and killed, they would make a declaration where this is, and there were the questions of the inquisitors to these persons. And when I started to read, I started to have in my mind this image of how this young woman would have answered in my imagination, and which kind of questions would she would be asked. So, and then I described all the scenes. For describing the scenes, I had to study, like, for example, the name of the parts of a ship in the 1400s, a Spanish ship that crossed the ocean in the late 1400s, like the name of a mechanism of. So if you want to be a real writer, you really have to dominate the vocabulary of many things, because it's a lot of descriptions. And if you don't give these descriptions, the story is not a story that the reader is going to like or imagine in his own mind. So, okay, so anthropology helped me to fix this, to find this time in the 1400s, to read how the people dressed, for example. What kind of clothes a young woman who was pregnant would wear. And so it's an example of a lot of effort I had to do. Also to know the problem. The problem was that the Inquisition was pursuing the Jews. There was a lot of suspicions if you did this or that on Saturdays. A lot of suspicion if you ate pork or you didn't eat pork. And it was a society that was based on pure suspicion of everything. Like, you couldn't trust anyone because, you know, if you did something and your own neighbor would be willing to to testify against you that he thought or she thought this or that. So really, anthropology helped me. If I hadn't been an anthropologist, how could I write a novel so specific? Also, I had to dominate the Spanish words they spoke, which was old Spanish words in the 1400s. For this, it took me about a year to know, and I had to read letters that were real, written in the 1400s, with this kind of Spanish. I think the novel is not so bad. I have this idea that the readers, they tell me, oh, well, really, it was good to read it, because you went into this scene where everything was like harmonious. But the main problem, which was a persecution, and that's my anthropological problem, the racism, prejudice, and persecution. That's my problem that I had studied before.
And do you see persecution, racism in Uruguay or in the broader context of South America specific, or is it comparable to, in your mind, does it matter that in other parts of the world similar problems pop up, or?
Not like in Europe, of course. Europe is Europe, and now anti-Semitism in Europe is increasing, as you know, as before the Second World War. Europe has these specific traditions in anti-Semitism that is different from South America. But yet, since my country, Uruguay, has been founded by immigrants that brought these traditions, there's a lot of anti-Semitism that is subtle. And of course it worries me. I was in this public school. I was 10 years old in my public school in Uruguay. And I had this best friend. She was very nice. She came from another school. That I don't know, the other school had closed or something. And her parents were Catholic. Our teacher told her to sit beside me. We were best friends. And then it happened that during Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, my father said to me, well, you don't have to go to school, but we rest, you stay at home, so you just don't go to school these 2 days. Because so I didn't. So when I came back into my school on the third day, I looked for my best friend, and she said, hi. She said, hi. I said, so I know you're Jewish, because she said, my parents told me, and now I cannot be your best friend anymore. She said like that. Exactly. So this experience, which is a basic experience of direct anti-Semitism, not her fault, of course, not her fault, but yet it was an experience of rejection. It was very, for a 10-year-old girl, it's very important. I always tell this story because it's a tiny story, but it's very, has a lot of consequences.
So did you ever meet this person again?
I know. And then at the end of the year, she left this public school, went back to a private school, and I went into, with other friends. I followed the rule.
So when you have 2 children?
Two big children.
Yes. But they are still your children. And I assume that they went to schools in Uruguay.
They went to Jewish school. It's double school. That is Spanish in the morning and Hebrew in the afternoon. And that's why I sent them to Jewish schools.
Because of anti-Semitism?
No, because it happened to me, my experience, which I just told you.
Okay, and so obviously then they were sheltered in a certain way from those kind of.
Yeah, I wanted to protect them.
And do you think that after they left the school, they were protected still, or they didn't?
This generation of my children, they didn't live this anti-Semitism as I did. I was born at the end of the Second World War. So, and my father, when I was old enough, told me, well, terrible things happened during the Second World War to the Jews. When I was like about 10, 11, he told me, and he said, you wouldn't want to know. And I said, I want to know. So he told me. Of course, in the terms of, that you use for a kid. But then I was curious, and I went by myself to learn more.
So could you tell me what was, how did he learn? Because I have to say...
They left because they left Latvia, Libau, because of anti-Semitism.
I understand, and I have to say that you have another professor at an American university who is related to your relative, and he has the whole family tree.
Oh, okay, online. Yeah, that's right.
And that's a very good source. It was a good source for me, at least, to get prepared for this conversation.
Yeah.
And I understand that they went back to both Lithuania and Latvia to...
Arturo, she's about Arturo.
I think
Arturo, he was the only one who went to see. See, he went back to see the old home of my grandparents. Mm-hmm. The building is still there. Mm-hmm. It's locked and old, but it's still there. Sí, fue.
Mm-hmm. Oh. And so do you know how your father learned about these events? The events of the Holocaust?
Because there was a daughter of my grandparents, my father's sister, who stayed mm-hmm. in Libau. She was murdered at the edge of a big, ¿cómo se dice, fosa? Like this big hole where they pit. Yeah, right.
Anna.
With her 2 teenage children.
Mm-hmm.
How do you say? Shot.
Shot in.
And her husband in another moment also.
Right.
So my family stopped receiving letters from her. My father and my grandmother.
So they knew that something happened to her. But
they knew everything because, it's a lie that people didn't know. They knew. The Jewish and non-Jewish, they knew.
I'm not suggesting that they couldn't know. I'm more interested in the technicalities, because the fact that letters stopped coming is a very common theme in understanding lives from such a distance. But obviously they couldn't know what exactly happened. And some people had to wait years until they actually realize.
Yeah, the specificities, mm-hmm. Yes. But in general, they knew that what was happening to the Jews. The sad thing is that whoever killed my aunt, right, and my 2 cousins and her husband, they were Latvians. They were Latvians that were for the Nazi ideas. There were some Nazis, but mainly they were Latvians followers of the Nazis.
Yes, it's a common theme in the history of Holocaust. The local collaborators and the local authorities committing crimes in the name of the Nazi racial.
Yes. So my grandfather had this. A good prospective mind of taking the decision of selling this bakery. They had a bakery mm-hmm. in Libau and selling everything and just coming. And he took 1928 was a good moment because in 4 years things would change radically. So he had this view of the future.
Mm-hmm. And do you know why the rest of the family remained there?
Because only Anna remained there. She was married already. She was the eldest. Mm-hmm. She was married. She had 2 children. Her husband had a good job. He was a tailor. So, and
parents were there. Her parents.
Mm. Yeah, I didn't know that.
So it's mostly for personal reasons. They didn't
Yes.
foresee what your grandfather did.
Yes.
Okay. So I understand that the one book that is translated to English is dedicated to Anna,
Yes, to her.
to your aunt or great aunt. Their story that stopped before coming to Uruguay, did it ever influence you or impact you in any way, either in your literary work or in your scholarly work?
Well, yeah.
And
Yeah, well, because the sadness of my father was like this, was my own sadness, you know, of this lost and this wide awareness of that the destiny or whatever you call it was so dark. So I as a child had this question: why did this happen to the Jews? And that was the big question. So I want to understand human conscience, human everything. I want to understand. That's why I did what I did.
So, but your father, you describe him as his sadness.
Yes.
Many people suffered from guilt or self blaming that they survived. This is a very typical. Did you experience that with him? Like, did he?
No. It was like they were saying, well, why didn't she come? We were all together here. Mm-hmm. Because she had come out for a visit for a month in those long journeys that you cross the ocean in a ship. She had come and visited, and they said, stay. No, I had to go back. I had my husband, my family, my kids, so she went back. That was what was a little like paradoxical.
Mm-hmm. So I think I have one more question or two more questions to ask. One is about the books, because you are sitting in front of books that came from Montevideo.
Oh yeah,
and
that's great.
And they are we call them as the books of the Montevideo Jewish community, but obviously, or not that obviously, they are actually all from Montevideo, but they were not only in communal ownership. And I was wondering if you had any kind of connection to
That's a story.
I'm not asking if you have any connections to books, but
this collection is a representation, a faithful one, of the whole process we were speaking about, of the whole process of the Jewish immigration from Europe to Uruguay. Because these books were brought, most of them, by the immigrants. They were brought from Europe. Many were printed in Uruguay. Also, I will speak about this point later. But the ones that were brought from Europe were very interesting. The places where they were published, the year they were published, the subject of the book. It shows the variety of the Eastern European culture, the wide variety, what the Jews read, which books the Jews loved, why the books were so important as to carry them to Uruguay. Because you don't carry any book. You carry the books that are special to you. Sometimes they were given in the bar mitzvah as a present. Sometimes somebody bought them and gave them to a lover, to a wife, to anyone. So they are special. And what I was in the Keilah many times in the old building, and every time I was doing this research, I went to this basement and tried to find a book about something specific, and couldn't find the book because it was dark, it was filthy, And somebody in the Keilah told me, no, these are books that were given when the families die, when the people die. Since you cannot throw away the books, you have to give them to someone. So they gave to the Keilah the books. So I started to think, but what does this mean? And then the rabbis stressed the fact that the books had to be buried in the cemetery, for example. So I realized this was a real value, and this is like a picture that you take of the interests of the Jewish immigrants that came to Uruguay. So I went through the books. I had some help by this friend of mine that was very interested in New Yiddish. 2 or 3 people who knew, I don't know Yiddish, and they started to go through the books. And then they started to find mathematics, philosophy, works of art like theater, translated into Yiddish, Shakespeare translated into Yiddish, Julio Verne translated into Yiddish. It was incredible that how Yiddish was the language through which many Jewish people learned of a variety of work of arts. It's very interesting. So which other minority in the world would translate these art creations into Yiddish, into their language? Maybe some of the Armenian, but I think the Jewish minority had this passion for life and passion for culture. And that's what I discovered, and then thanks God, Marta and other people were as interested and as fascinated as me. And so this project really worked. Mm-hmm. But since the books are after death, the authors are talking to you. That's a fantastic thing that one realizes. This author 500 years ago wrote this, and he's talking to me, he's speaking to me through the book. It's something that no one can deny that this is happening. It's a marvelous thing. So these authors were speaking to the immigrants when they had in this crisis that they had to leave, because many of the immigrants were refugees, and they had to live with the least things that they could carry, because they couldn't carry almost anything, but they would carry the books.
So when you write,
yeah,
do you have the same feeling in your or the same concept in your mind that you are talking to people who you will never meet? And
yes. Well, I don't think I'm so important as the authors of the books. I'm in a modest way, yes.
Is there anything I didn't ask and you think?
No, I thank you very much for the questions. They made me think a lot. I didn't follow the protocol that you wrote.
That's fine.
Like we say in an interview from the 2000, you suggested that books were losing their former capacity to influence the public. That's why I would add this, yes. Mm-hmm. And the internet, yeah, this is very true, but I have reconsidered.
Okay, books. So I asked the question so that it will be clear about the question. So you gave an interview in 2000, yes. And I found it in the internet. And in that interview, you said that it was in Spanish, and you said that. So I assume it was local Montevideo. Somebody with a literary interest. So,
sí.
And you said that, in your view, books are losing their influence on the public. You think that you said that you thought that an internet page would have a much stronger impact on.
Yeah, but I reconsidered.
Okay.
There's another function because of books, mm-hmm. which is the introspection that the reader and the writer do through the book. maybe the book is not going to influence anyone, but has already done the process of introspection and pondering about very intimate and personal issues, also dealing with historical environment and situations. So this capacity for introspection that the book gives to the reader and to the writer, first to the writer, then to the reader, is unique. I cannot think of any other technique. Maybe, well, psychologists probably disagree with me, but I cannot think of any other technique so precious as writing and reading for doing this process of intimate introspection into any issue. Full stop, I would say. So the other consequences, if it influences a lot of people or a very small quantity, I also have reconsidered, even if the book influences very small quantity of people, this quantity of people could make changes that no other majority could make on society. So it doesn't matter how many people read a book, it matters who reads a book, who reads a book, and what is the effect of this book in that person, in that specific person, you, Kathleen or Marta, what is the specific consequence? Because it's not the same reader of the same book. Each reader will give different, purpose to the same content. Will do a different introspection about the same content, and this is unique.
So would you say that the opposite is true as well? Whoever doesn't read a book has no influence?
Whoever doesn't read a book doesn't make this process of introspection, doesn't know himself or herself, doesn't find illumination about an issue. Yes. Well, maybe he can go to the cinema and see a very good movies. I'm not saying that, but what I mean is that art, that's good literature, good cinema, good drama. Art means by which one gets introspection in many issues. And otherwise, you wouldn't understand the world. You couldn't understand the world. Mm-hmm. So even if internet is very famous and spread out and books inside art, I mean good books, literary work of art, are going to influence more and more.
And how do you feel about scholarly books?
Yeah,
they include them as well?
Scholarly books are, of course, as long as techniques and knowledge improves, have to deal with this quantity of knowledge and explain it. But they are not meant for introspection. Mm-hmm. They are meant only for functioning, for knowing how the world functions.
And do you think that libraries can take a role in promoting this introspective, the quest for introspection?
Of course. Then they, even if they have less readers, they will do this. Mm-hmm. They will offer this space where you can be with yourself, speaking and listening to somebody who was dead for 500 years and is talking to you, not to anyone else, but to you. Mm-hmm. It's talking to you in the moment that you're reading.
So I think basically we talked about everything that we planned to talk. So is there anything you think we should mention or to add?
No, thank you very much. It has been a great opportunity for me to ponder over so many issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you.